Strange, unusual, different. Three words that are quite often used negatively to describe something, but in this case, I'm using those three adjectives with the utmost respect. Killer 7 is beautifully weird, and without sounding too cliched, it does dare to be different. Looking back at it now, it still looks absolutely stunning. This is a game that many people say effectively launched Goichi Suda, also known as Suda 51. Yep, that guy that brought us Lollipop Chainsaw, and he is someone I hugely admire because he chooses to do things his way. Hello everyone, I'm Roy McCoy, and the focus of this video is, of course, the superb Killer 7. Now, I remember playing this back in 2005 on the GameCube, and I had never played anything quite like it before, and as far as I can remember, there hasn't been anything quite like it since. In my opinion, this game is brilliant, and as I said before, strange, unusual, unique, and very, very different. And honestly, I love it. So in this video, first of all, we're going to talk about what the game is, which in this case, it's quite complicated. And then I'll talk about what happened to it, the development, the release, and the reception, and finally, I'll be moving on to that all-important question, could we ever see another one? Now, before we get started, don't forget to smash that like button, as it really does help out. And if you fancy chatting about this game or other games, I'll put a link to the Discord in the description below. But now, without any further ado, let's talk about one of the strangest and most beautifully unusual games that I have ever played. So, what is Killer 7? Well, let's try and sum it up in a nutshell before going into a little bit more detail. Now, at its core, it's a third-person action-adventure game, but the majority of the movement is in fact on rails. There are also first-person shooter mechanics and some puzzle elements to the game that I'll go into later. Killer 7 has stylized graphics. I mean, look at it. It still looks absolutely beautiful. And we're talking 17 years ago that this game was made, and it still holds up. That is a testament to the fact that these graphics were made to last. The stylized look, the beautiful use of bold color, it still looks fantastic. Moving on to the audio, and the music and voiceovers were superb. Looking back to 2005 when this game was first made, the standard of voiceovers at the time wasn't the best thing about the gaming industry. But this one holds up. The voiceovers are on par with something that you would hear today. And the music is just sensational. This game also contains strong themes of violence and sex and has quite the complicated noir plot. This game was effectively Marmite. You either loved it or you hated it, and that is what the critics said. The unusual blend of mechanics, controls, and that plot that I'm about to dive into effectively polarized critics. However, this game developed a cult following. Now, I have already mentioned that complicated noir plot, so let's dive into it. I'm going to say for a segue at this point, if you haven't had a coffee yet, now might be the time, because it is a little bit involved. The game takes place in an alternate timeline. Peace is the order of the day after an international treaty was signed and all nuclear weapons were exploded in the atmosphere in an event called Fireworks. On top of that, the International Ethics Committee has decided to get rid of all air travel and public use of the internet to reduce terrorism, cyber-terrorism, and pandemics, which actually seems to resonate more now than it did back in the day. And instead of planes, we have intercontinental roads linking the world, so I'm not quite sure how that would avoid pandemics. Anyway, so this dystopian future sounds kind of peaceful, right? Well, not for long, because that's when Heaven Smile come in. Heaven Smile are a new terrorist group that target the UN and the International Ethics Committee. But these terrorists are unlike anything seen before. They are basically mutants that are invisible and explode. The game focuses on tensions in relations between the US and Japan. Japan in this game, in this dystopian future, is dominated by two political parties. There's the UN Party and the Liberal Party. The UN Party is more powerful and decides it wants to control the world under Japanese rule. However, this doesn't sit very well with the US government, who decides to send the Killer 7 to assassinate key members of the UN Party. But of course, all doesn't go well for the team of assassins, as Heaven Smile are there to stop us. And if you have any further questions about this, I'm not surprised, but one burning one has to be this: how did these humans become mutant bombs? Well, that's because their leader, Kun Lan, used a power called God Hand to transform them into walking, laughing bombs. Laughing is important, we'll get into that. And that effectively, in a nutshell, is the plot. And to be honest, I absolutely love the plot and backstory of this game. But the weirdness doesn't stop there. The player takes control of that group of assassins called Killer 7, but considering this is a Suda 51 title, Killer 7 isn't just 7 individual people. No, the group is led by an elderly wheelchair-bound man and his name is Harmon Smith. So he's kind of like Killer 7's Professor Xavier? Yeah, let's go with that. Harmon Smith has something called multifoliate personae phenomenon, and this effectively allows Harmon Smith to transform into any one of his persona, meaning that he can become any one of the 7 assassins. So effectively you play as 7 characters that is actually just one character. Harmon Smith is voiced beautifully by Dwight Schultz, and if that name rings a bell, he's the original Howling Mad Dog Murdoch from the A-Team, not the remake film, but the original TV series. How awesome is that? Thanks Suda51 for making that happen. So, as I said, Harmon Smith can transform into any one of 7 persona. Basically means there are 7 different playable characters, and each of them have different skills. However, there is another wonderful side effect to this phenomenon. They can see the ghosts of previous victims of the Killer 7, one of which is dressed in a full bondage suit. Is there any more to this story? Well, yeah, kind of course there is, it's a Suda51 title. There's a backstory between Harmon Smith and Kun Lan. They were old friends, which effectively ties in with that wonderful little comparison I made. So you've got Professor X and Magneto. Done. So that is, in a nutshell, the plot and the story. So now let's dive into the mechanics. Now, the complicated plot was just one of the things that caused division among critics, but there was also the mechanics. Effectively, you take control during most of your movement phase on rails in a third-person view. You press one button to go forward and another button to go backwards. When you reach a junction where you can go in a different direction, you just select the place you want to go. As I said, this is a game that dared to do something different, and honestly, it really worked for me, but I can understand this kind of linear feel to the movement could also feel restrictive. There were also some first-person shooter mechanics. While you're running around the levels pushing your button to go forward or backwards, you will suddenly hear a laughing sound. And that means that Heaven Smiles are in the area. You then flip to the first person mode and scan the environment to find these invisible Heaven Smiles. While you're in the first person view, you cannot move, but you use your analog stick to target specific areas. Blowing off certain body parts like a leg will disable them and then leave them crawling along the ground to kill you. There's also critical points that instantly kills them, and if they get too close, boom, they explode and do you damage. Do too much damage and you're dead, but don't panic, because a character called Garcian Smith can use a special ability to revive your character. However, if Garcian dies, it is game over. So that basically covers the story, the third-person game mechanics, and of course the first-person shooter. But there's one more element to this game, and that is puzzle solving. In Killer 7, there are a number of puzzles, and some of them require different characters to get past them. For example, there's a guy with big guns that can explode holes in walls, or a girl that can cut herself and flick blood everywhere to find secret passages. I told you this game was unusual. And because everybody has different skills, some of which unlock puzzles, that means you will need to utilize your different personalities throughout the game. There are also some other puzzles that require a certain number of enemies to be killed, and others that relate to certain items that you'll find throughout the game. Now, that brings us to the end of what the game is. I told you this one was complicated, so now let's talk about the development of this game. Development for Killer 7 started sometime around 2002, and it was originally meant to be one of the Capcom 5. If that means nothing to you, well, it's because at that period of time the GameCube wasn't performing overly well. Therefore, Capcom decided to create the Capcom 5, which consisted of 5 games. Those 5 games were PN03, Beautiful Joe, Dead Phoenix, which never came out, Resident Evil 4, and Killer 7. While most of the titles were overseen by Shinji Mikami, Killer 7 was actually developed by Capcom's Production Studio 4 and Grasshopper Manufacture, which is Suda51's company. Now, all of the Capcom 5 were originally designed to be just GameCube exclusives. However, Dead Phoenix never made it out of development, and 3 of them, Resident Evil 4, Killer 7, and Beautiful Joe, ended up on the PS2 as well. PN03 was the only game that remained an Xbox exclusive. Killer 7 was subject to a few delays and eventually came out in 2005. Something of interest is the amount of content from this game that was cut for the final version, and it was reduced to make it snappier and more concise. And I have to say, playing the final product was amazing, but I do long to play that extra content. But to be honest, I think Suda51 got it right. The game feels balanced. Suda51 was influenced heavily by film noir and the theme of multiple personality disorder. The game finally released after several delays in 2005. So now let's talk about the reception, and as I said at the start of the video, it was a divisive one. Some people described it more as being like an interactive story than something like a traditional game, and that is not a bad thing in my opinion. However, the depiction of sex and violence in the game did create a lot of debates. Everything about this game was effectively divisive. There was a lot of criticism out there, and I get it. I totally get it. The controls weren't for everybody. The story was complex, and to be honest, it could be a little bit confusing at times, and it did use a lot of gratuitous references to sex and violence. And of course, bad language. But I have to reiterate that I absolutely adored this game. The Metacritic score at the time of making this video on the GameCube is 74, which is an okay score. I personally think it deserves higher. Let me know your opinion if you've ever played this game in the comments below. Basically, the game's unconventional format split the critics down the middle, but as I said at the start of this video, it became a cult hit. And while it sold modestly at the time, it has remained fondly in the hearts of many a fan, including my own. Which is why over the years there has been a huge calling for a sequel to Killer 7. So now let's move on to that section of the video. Now, we did get a remaster of this game in 2018 for the PC, and in my opinion, it still looks and feels absolutely great, but sadly, once again, in terms of sales, it didn't set the world on fire. But in terms of a sequel, over the years, Suda51 has expressed his interest in making one. However, he has stipulated that it will probably never happen, and that is in part due to the fact that Capcom still own the rights to the IP. But it's clear from things he said that Suda51 absolutely adores Killer 7. He has even previously described it as part of his soul. There was another game called Killer is Dead, and many fans hoped that this was the true sequel to Killer 7, but sadly that wasn't the case. So let's be straight, could we ever see a Killer 7 sequel? Well, I would have said before the Killer 7 remaster in 2018, probably not. Mainly considering that Capcom do still hold the rights to the IP, and therefore it's not going to be made without their say-so. But the fact that there was that remaster means that there has been a conversation between Suda51 and Capcom about Killer 7. That 2018 remaster was possibly an attempt to test the water to see if people still wanted a Killer 7. Sadly though, it's quite possible that those sales, disappointing as they were, quite possibly put off Capcom from investing more money into the franchise. And to be honest, looking at the sales of the first time round and the remaster, it would be difficult to justify for Capcom to invest into it. It has been 16 years since we got the game for the first time, and despite the fact that people are still clamoring for it, I cannot see it being high on Capcom's priority list. There are probably other things higher on that list, things like Dino Crisis or Onimusha, that also deserve to come back, and possibly the only way we would ever see a Killer 7 sequel or full remake is if Suda51 purchased the rights and made it off his own bat. But as Capcom hold the rights at this moment, I am erring on the side of caution. Capcom will be investing in other remakes, and there are far too many games like Dino Crisis on that list that need to be remade as well. So I'm going to say probably not. Not for a long time. Now, I hope I'm wrong. Let me know in the comments below what you think is going to happen to this fantastic game that could have launched an amazing series. Let's have a chat about it, and do join me on Discord. But from me today, all that leaves me to say is thank you very much for watching this video, and this is McCoy, out!